Hi, this is Gavin from FE News. I'm here at UCL, the Institute of Education, to chat with a bunch of experts, leaders in their field around what is the future of education and work, to also unpack some of their interesting research projects to see what we can learn and how we can take the sector forward. So this is Gavin from FE News. I'm here today at UCL chatting with different experts around what is the future of education and work, and I'm here today with Dr Jay Derrick. Jay, can we talk about lifelong learning and particularly the importance of informal learning?
Okay, well, I'm interested in talking about this, spurred on from a whole flurry of reports that were published in the late autumn, actually in late November, early December, around the time of the election actually, from a variety of sources about adult education and lifelong learning, which in the UK is in a pretty bad state. I've worked in lifelong learning in one form or another for my whole career. I started in a voluntary adult education centre teaching people to read. And then I came to London, where there was a huge network of local authority supported adult education programmes. Every part of London had its own adult education institute with tens of thousands of students. A lot of work was done. The local authority famously managed to get all kinds of people involved in adult education. It wasn't just in the evening, although famously it was evening classes, but it wasn't just evening, it was daytime. But they got all classes of people, all people with all different backgrounds were all involved to a degree not found generally in other parts of social services and social provision. It was very successful in that sense, and it was there was the networks in each area were both public sector supported by the local authority and voluntary organisations and community, and in some private as well. What's happened over the last 30 years, and this is absolutely not a party political issue, is that all of this has been massively reduced, and it's happened more or less by accident. And it's because the focus of education policy has become formal educational outcomes, and particularly educational outcomes which are understood to help with work and getting people into work and helping people be better at work and to help the workplace and our economy become more prosperous. And the belief was that if you focused education down on those particular purposes, then you would get more prosperity, and you would be using the taxpayer value, as it were, of the cost of educational provision would be greater. There isn't actually much evidence that this is the case. We've got 30 years odd of experience of this now, these kinds of policies through successive governments. And it's not clear that it's worked. But what has happened for certain is that far fewer people are taking part in educational activities as adults than used to be the case, because there's research been going on every year from originally the National Institute of Adult Education and now the Learning and Work Institute, have been measuring, literally. They've been doing surveying, I think it's thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands every year, about their participation in learning activities. Now, this can't be a good thing. There is actually quite a lot of research evidence to suggest that it's a bad thing. Not so much that it's that people should be going to classes or they should be doing this or should be doing that, but more that if they do engage, perhaps in quite a light way, loose way, with various kinds of activity involving learning, all sorts of social benefits and economic benefits do accrue. We always argued, a long time ago I remember, that informal adult education got people into formal adult education and formal classes. It was a stepping stone for people who had had a bad previous experience of school maybe, and they needed to put a foot in the water. They weren't confident. Informal adult education helps them gain confidence to start doing things seriously. The other problem, of course, is that what remains is expensive. It's not that there's no provision around, but it's very hard to find public services aren't able to support it to the extent they used to be able to. So what remains is often run by private organisations, and it has to at least cover its costs, and usually it has to make a profit, which means it's relatively expensive, which means that lots of people can't do it. So this is, and the argument is, and that's made by all these reports, which come from different situations. Some of them are produced by political parties as their manifestos about education. Others are from the UNESCO, the Global Adult Learning and Education Report, published in December, which is based on data from all over the world, suggests that the kind of informal learning I'm talking about does have benefits to society. An interesting point is that last year was the centenary of one of the biggest and most important reports on adult education produced by the British government in 1919 as part of the reconstruction after the First World War. That also argued for the same points, and in a way the things they argued then are absolutely still true, and maybe truer now than they were 30 years ago. We need local informal networks of learning opportunities for people to drop into as and when they feel like it and when they're able to, because adults have other responsibilities. They're not students. They describe themselves as parents maybe, or as carers, or as professional workers, or whatever. But they've got other things they have to do. And so learning is part of what they do. It's generally not the whole thing. And so they need to be able to dip in and out as it fits with the rest of their lives. And that's why you need these informal networks, relatively informal networks. They could include formal learning. The argument isn't that we shouldn't have classes, but we should remember that an awful lot of the most important learning that we all do doesn't go on in formal classes. It goes on in all parts of our lives, for better or worse. Some of this learning is productive and some of it actually is not. People learn bad things sometimes through bad experiences in life. So what policy should be doing, it seems to me, is to make sure that there's a great number of opportunities, that these opportunities for people to dip into are as varied and widespread as possible, and that they should also provide some formal opportunities too, and make them accessible, which means generally cheap, and available everywhere, not just in big centres like big cities, or the centre of big cities, on housing estates, in country towns, or everywhere like this. I mean, none of this is rocket science. And the odd thing is that we used to have it, and we don't have it now to the same degree at all. And that seems to me to be a tragedy, but also dangerous. We're heading for a society which is kind of immature in all sorts of ways. And that's what the 1919 report is very clear about. What you need is people who are, if they're going to be good citizens, and this is where democracy comes in, they need to have the confidence they need to have some knowledge, they need to have thought about things, they need to have talked about things with their friends and people they meet. They need to be critical, they need to understand that there are differences of opinion, and that's not a bad thing. And they need the confidence to make their point, to have their point of view. It's part of engagement in civic society, without which it quite quickly can descend into a situation where people are completely cynical about everything, and that provides a breeding ground for all types of bad politics. So this is why, in a very general way, I'm arguing relatively incoherently, why informal learning, which is generally forgotten by policy, but is really important, and it's not that difficult to provide an infrastructure for it. We had it in 30 years ago. In terms of the cost, the cost of not doing it is far greater than the cost of doing it. Most of the institutions and buildings and conventions are actually still around. They're just very impoverished at the moment. They include things like public libraries, parks, allotments, community centres, and so on and so on. Swimming pools, sports facilities, all of which are harder to get access to these days, or more expensive. And this is not the way we should be going. So that's the argument of all of these reports. And for what it's worth, it's an argument I'm making based on a career of 40 years in lifelong learning.
You mentioned the UNESCO report, particularly they had a really interesting quote that I want to sort of to relay on to the audience really is, adult learning infrastructure is a central feature of a healthy democracy. So, as you're saying, informal centres of learning could be anything from an allotment to a village hall to to a pub to a library. What can we learn from these reports across the globe as to what we should be thinking of, not just now but for the future?
Well, the reports are generally based on evidence of one kind, or research evidence of one kind or another. And there is research evidence to suggest that participation in learning, and that's usually going to have an element of formality to it, does increase levels of tolerance, for example. Just to take one example, it's like the more you know about the civic situation, the more knowledge you've got about it, the chances are you're going to have a view which is, your views will be less defensive and more open to people being different, for example. That seems to me to be a good thing. Most of us want, recognise the importance of diversity to some degree, and intolerance is not a basis for a healthy democracy. Intolerance of other people because they're different. So if that research, there needs to be more research of this kind, but insofar as it exists, it seems to me that's a pretty important argument for doing it. And the point is that research that produces those results has been going on for many years. It's not huge, there probably needs to be more, but there are reports from 2004 that a lot of colleagues from the Institute of Education were involved in, 2014 also the same, and then there are these global reports. They're not just about Britain. So I think we should be paying attention to this in terms of trying to help our society deal with the problems facing us.
I think on the policy front, that's sort of in a way out of our hands. We can sort of raise the flag and say, look, we need to pay attention here. But looking on a more sort of micro level, how can the findings around informal learning, how can that impact the educator's role? How should we adopt or adapt education strategy to include informal learning or blended learning? What would your sort of suggestions be around that? Well,
there's a number of points there which are interesting. One is the educator. You mentioned the educator. What all my remarks so far have been about policy frameworks. I'm not a fan of policy telling us all what to do in a great deal of detail. I think one of the mistakes we've made in education policy is too much detail, over-specified. And the problem is what works better is fairly loose frameworks to allow all sorts of things to flourish. The thing about the educator is that people think of that as being a teacher. Now, a lot of what I'm talking about doesn't involve teachers at all. You need a framework of formal education with teachers, I think. Teachers have the whole point about going to a class of one kind or another is that somebody's got some knowledge that you'd like, some expertise you'd like to gain or work towards. And that's important, but people actually educate themselves to a very large degree. And again, there's this phrase, for better or worse. So what you want is a kind of community which is open to new ideas and critical, and that people are quite happy to have arguments. My experience is that it's very difficult to have disagreements with people these days. It's much more difficult than it used to be. People are frightened of disagreeing overtly in speech, particularly with strangers. It's almost like seen as rude, and potentially you're asking for trouble. Whereas my sense is that in the past that wasn't nearly so much the case. People had robust arguments all the time. We we make jokes about pub conversations and pub arguments, but actually that's where a lot of this, what I'm talking about, that kind of interaction is what I'm talking about. There's usually a focus for it. In an allotment, for example, there'll be discussions about how to use the resources, how to make sure things are secure, how to prevent dishonesty and within the community of the allotment. All of those kinds of discussions really make a difference, for better or worse, and I would call that learning. I think that should be described as learning. It's certainly a kind of infrastructure and a kind of hinterland for formal learning. You know, if you think of yourself to some degree as a learner, somebody who's got things to learn, then the chances are you'll do better when you go join formal education anyway. So for all these reasons, I think the informal learning I'm talking about is essential to make the formal learning work better. And that's been forgotten by policy. So my main remarks have been about policy rather than about what teachers might do. Although I think teachers also need to recognise in formal educational situations that there's a lot of informal learning going on in the classes too, for better or worse. So people take away from a class all sorts of things they were not intended to take away. And that always happens. So I think teachers can be aware of that, and that's helpful if they're taking account of the fact that people bring different things to every situation and take different things away. Another thing, it's a bit inconsequential, goes back to what we were talking about before. I think another of the key benefits of this kind of learning is mental well-being, support for mental robustness, and there's evidence for that. There's quite a lot of evidence for that. NIACE years ago, the National Institute for Adult Education, were saying years ago they reckoned that there was evidence to support the idea that GPs should actually prescribe joining in adult education classes. And again, it's easy to joke about these things, but the evidence is good that actually, and pills are often part of a problem, people's problems. So that's kind of, I think we need to take seriously, that being involved and being engaged, it's easy to be cynical about it, but actually people taking part in things is very much what we're talking about here. Taking part in social activities which involve learning.
So basically what you're saying is informal learning is better or worse. It's richer and poorer by enriching the learner, but unfortunately informal and adult learning is in its poorer stage at the moment, and we need to be addressing that really.
Well, I think in every community it seems to me that the infrastructure which supports informal learning by providing opportunities for people to meet people they don't know and interact with them or around some activity or other, I think there are fewer of those activities. It's really quite simple. Community centres are not doing as much as they used to do. Local authorities are not able to run the kinds of classes that used to take place in the 70s and 80s, at a time when an adult education institute building was often one where you would have more diversity of people from the local community than in any other public building at the time. All kinds of people from the community were there. ILEA was the Inner London Education Authority, which used to run things in those days, certainly in the middle of London, was famous that all parts of the community were involved in their classes, except one, which they were not so successful at, statistically, which was white working class men. But at the same time, in those days, the Ford factory in Dagenham ran a very interesting project supported by the trade unions there, in which Ford paid for a couple of £100 worth of adult education for every employee in the Dagenham plant. And it was incredibly successful. Nearly all those employees were men. And it was incredibly successful. And the only prescription was, you can do anything you like so long as it's not to do with work. So people did languages, and they did gardening and horticulture and stuff like that, and a whole range of different things. So actually that group as well, white working class men, not all those men were white, but a lot of them were, can also be cracked if the opportunity is there, and it's presented in a way that is certainly not compulsory, but is made attractive. And this isn't that difficult to do. It does cost money, but not as much as possibly the cost of the damage done by not doing it.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Why not click subscribe so you can be informed when the latest next individual podcasts or podcast mini-series from FE News are going to be released.